effort. It's going to require coalitions of common interests, which we are forming. So basically there he's saying that they're forming this global government, and ISIL is actually helping them do exactly that. And that's what we've been reporting about here. That's what it's all about. They're arming them. Oops, we accidentally dropped some more weapons into the hands of ISIS. Darn, now they've got even better weapons. You know, so it's just more of the same.
It's more of the same because we see Mrs. Clinton even admits that we created the Mujahideen. And then, you know, you got Al-Qaeda, you got ISIS now, like you said, accidentally arming these people that we're fighting against. You know, just like, well, it wasn't an accident. They did very much on purpose when they armed the Mexican drug cartels with Operation Fast and Furious. There's an accident that they got caught. You know, They always want to talk about the gun registration and all these other measures for you, the private citizen. Meanwhile, you know, while they're talking about universal background checks for you and me, I think they really did do a universal background check on these Mexican drug cartels to give them to the worst people possible. You know, they gave these guns, these fully functioning guns, no RFID chips or anything that I'm aware of, to these drug cartels. Now, I do believe we have David Knight waiting in the wings. Can you hear me there, David?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Earlier today, I interviewed someone from the Free State Project in New Hampshire because, you know, we have a lot of people who follow us and they understand the fraud, the manipulation that's inherent in our electoral system, just as we were talking to Bev Harris earlier today with black box voting about the many different ways that the system is gamed. So what do we do about that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of different ways you can get involved, and we're going to talk about that at the end of this segment. We're going to play that interview that's with a state representative in New Hampshire. And of course, in New Hampshire, they came up with the idea that they would try to get a critical mass in a small state of about 20,000 people. They're nearly there. They've got a little over 16,000 now. And they've had several people elected to the state house. They've had 20 people elected to the state house, even though that's a small number of the overall representatives there. They have 400 representatives in New Hampshire, and to put that in perspective, that's about one representative for about 3,300 people.
Yeah.
In U.S. Congress, that's about, you have one congressperson for about 500,000 people. Or looking at it from a different perspective, if we had the same ratio, there would be 99,000 congressmen in the U.S. Congress if we had that kind of representation. So we don't have much representation at the federal level. That's part of the problem. And in New Hampshire, they've got a smaller state. They've got more direct local control there. And of course, people have also gotten involved there in terms of direct action. And Keene is a big example of that. We're going to be talking to the state representative. We'll have that interview at the end of the segment. But I wanted to, before we get to that, talk about some amendments that were on the ballot in various states today and how they turned out. In North Carolina, there was a constitutional amendment that would waive the right to trial by jury for felony charges. Now, this is something that would allow the person who is being charged with a felony to voluntarily waive that right. It was demanded by the North Carolina Constitution. They said, we need to get this out of the way because we need to streamline the justice system. The problem is that, of course, they're going to use pressure in terms of plea bargaining, as we've seen. We've essentially seen trial by jury evaporate throughout the United States because of this kind of plea bargaining pressure where they trump up the charges against someone and then say, if you will plead guilty to these lesser charges, we'll take off these other phony charges. That's what's going to happen. People are going to lose their right to a trial by jury. Of course, they're not exercising that right in most cases. And in many cases, it doesn't work because the jurors are not fully informed of what their duty is. But it's sad to see that fail in North Carolina. 54% of the people said they didn't value their right to a trial by jury. That's a sad state of affairs. A little bit better in Tennessee. Now, in Tennessee, they do not have a state income tax, but several times in recent history, they've tried to impose that on the people of Tennessee. So they put a ballot measure there to say that there will never be an income or payroll tax, and that won 66 to 33%. In Florida, the medical marijuana initiative failed. It became very close. It was just under 60%. They needed 60% to make that pass. The interesting thing about this, I think, is that when this first qualified for the ballot this summer, it had 90% support in the public. Now, they got behind that and opposed it. It was Sheldon Adelson was the person who was most involved in that, providing 85% of the funding. Sheldon Adelson, if you don't know, is a casino owner in Las Vegas, very big in the gambling industry. He was someone who was instrumental in the primary in the 2012 caucuses there in Las Vegas. He famously got a caucus set up for a Sunday that was originally scheduled for a Saturday night, and he got it set up for a Sunday and tried to enforce that only Orthodox Jews would be allowed to vote in that process. And he is someone who gave millions to the campaign of Newt Gingrich, essentially a one-man super PAC for Newt Gingrich. He gave $15,000 to Lindsey Graham, and immediately Lindsey Graham introduced an online gaming ban. Of course, I'm sure that was just a coincidence, but here you have a situation where he can give $15,000 to Lindsey Graham when Dinesh D'Souza talks to some friends and raises $20,000 because he didn't follow the letter of the law. He didn't just get a civil penalty, he got a criminal penalty. They're going to send him to jail for that. But of course, Sheldon Adelson can give millions to Newt Gingrich, he can give $15,000 to Lindsey Graham, and he can give $4 million to stop medical marijuana in Florida, and he did. He got what he wanted. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the no people were saying that medical marijuana was going to be an excuse for outright legalization, and so it had to be stopped. Where was Sheldon Adelson on the legalization initiatives in the District of Columbia, in Oregon, in Alaska? Not a dime for those. So basically what he did was, even though they're saying we can't have medical marijuana, we can't allow the compassionate treatment for people who are suffering under cancer therapy, under HIV therapy, under many different issues. It even is very beneficial for glaucoma. We will not allow that for medical purposes. We will send people to jail, saying that they don't want to see this turn into a legalization thing, and yet he doesn't support a ban on legalization in these other states. So what is the issue there? Well, Vice magazine looked at it, as reported earlier. They said he has tried several times to get into the casino business in Florida, which currently is controlled by the Seminole tribe, the Indian tribe there in Florida. So perhaps that's part of the move. I don't know. Nevertheless, it is sad to see that that option taken off the table for people in Florida. Now, in other news, we see that, and we're going to talk about people in New Hampshire, libertarians who are standing up for their rights, basically standing up to parking meter maids, paying off people's parking as their parking meter expires, putting money in the meter so they don't get a ticket. That's a very visible example of standing up for fellow citizens, and I think it's something that's really helped them in the public light. It's something that's not a big fine, but it's a nuisance fine for people. They did, in fact, cost the city $80,000, and the city got quite irate about it. But there are other ways to engage in civil disobedience. And we've reported on this before. Pulpit Freedom Sunday is a thing that happens once a year by an organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom. And this year, they did it again, and they endorsed candidates from the pulpit. This is one way that the IRS has intimidated people. You know, it's not just going after the Tea Party. For decades, the IRS has been intimidating pastors from talking about politics or moral issues from the pulpit in a way that would get involved in politics. Now, this is something that, you know, the original Tea Party, I could say, was the Black Regiment of the American Revolution. It was the pastors who galvanized their congregation about issues like religious freedom and free speech and things that really set afire the 1776 revolution. But of course, they stopped all this using the IRS to intimidate people with an amendment that was passed by Lyndon Johnson. That is in direct conflict with the First Amendment, and so the Alliance Defending Freedom has taken the idea that they're going to directly challenge this. So for several years now, they've had thousands of pastors make explicit endorsements from the pulpit on a specific Sunday and then tape that and send it to the IRS, defying them to do something about it. And like we see in so many different instances, like we saw with John Corbett standing up to the TSA, like we saw with the fellow in Michigan, Baker's Green Acres, who stood up to the Department of Natural Resources there in Michigan, who said that he could not raise a certain type of pig. It costs people a lot to stand up to that. But eventually, if you persist at it, if they don't drive you out of business, if they don't totally bankrupt you, they will eventually ignore you and leave you alone. And that's what they're doing now with the pastors there. They have yet to come back to any of the pastors and say that they're going to take away their tax exemption, which, of course, is the sword of Damocles that they hang over their heads. Now, last election in 2012 in North Carolina, there was a constitutional amendment passed to ban same-sex marriage. That year, I think it was 5 states had that issue before them. 3 of them accepted same-sex marriage. 2 of them rejected it. North Carolina was one of those to reject it. What has happened this year, just within the last month or so, a North Carolina judge had rejected that constitutional amendment, said that it was unconstitutional according to the U.S. Constitution. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. They refused to hear it, so it stands. Now, the fallout of that, I think, brings up an interesting point, and that is the conflict of rights. We've seen that the Libertarian Party in most instances has come down on the side of same-sex marriage, saying that that's a civil liberties issue. But when they force people to recognize it, or in this case, when they force magistrates or they force pastors to marry people, I think at that point, they are infringing on someone else's rights. Certainly no one is suggesting anywhere that I know of that homosexual people would not be allowed to live together, to do whatever they wish, but there are a lot of people who don't want to be compelled to participate in their wedding, to marry them, to take photographs or whatever, and we see over and over again in different places that now that is turning into a coercive measure against people violating their religious freedom. And so we see that some North Carolina judges have now resigned rather than perform these marriages because they say that conflicts with their religious freedom. It brings up an interesting conflict of rights. And this organization that has organized Pulpit Freedom Sunday is telling them, you don't have to resign. You can stand on your First Amendment rights. So I think this is going to make an interesting case of a conflict of rights. We have seen that in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a couple who had a marriage chapel there, and they were also, I think, ministers in some church there, said that they did not want to perform same-sex marriages. They are now have the municipality coming after them, threatening them with several months in jail and thousands of dollars in fines. So that is now going into a legal court case there. So it's not a clear case that if you have a ballot amendment that gets passed, that you're not going to have that struck down by a court judge. We've seen the same thing happen in New Hampshire with the fully informed jury law that was passed there by the legislature, saying that the judge would not, could not take punitive measures against a lawyer who argued for jury nullification and could not prohibit a defendant from making that argument. That has now been struck down by a judge, so there's still work to do there. But as we see, there's many ways that you can approach that, and as we're going to see now in this interview in New Hampshire, they're coming at it from an educational standpoint as well. Having people show up at the courthouse when they're picking juries, educating jurors as to what their rights and their responsibilities are as jurors. They have a right and a duty to judge the law as well as the facts of the case. And so if we have people that understand and exercise those rights, understand their duty and exercise that duty, that is what's going to be needed to bring back trial by jury. As we see in North Carolina, they just said, well, I don't think we need that anymore. We can just streamline this case. I don't think so. Without further ado, let's go to that interview we had with Mark Warden in New Hampshire. He's a state representative. He moved there as part of the Free State Project, and we talked to him about working within the system and working outside of the system. You know, there's a lot of ways to game the political system to try to get the results that you want to have happen. We've seen this in the past with gerrymandering. That served the interest of various political parties. We see Obama essentially doing this with open borders and trying to open the voting rolls to people who aren't even citizens, trying to get a reliable block of voters who are going to support his agenda for a more socialist welfare state. What if that were done to serve the cause of freedom? In 2001, a Yale doctorate student, Jason Sorens, came up with the idea for the Free State Project. They wanted to find a state where they could move a lot of people who were interested in liberty, where they could collect together and move that state instead of being diluted amongst the 50 states. New Hampshire was an ideal location because of its small size, because of its small government, and because the legislators there are so responsive, so local to the public, with just a few people per legislator. They're only paid $100 a year in New Hampshire. So it's a more open